July 19th, 1942. The North Sea was gray, restless, and deceptively calm. A formation of German destroyers cut through the cold water at speed, steel hulls slicing the waves as they conducted routine operations. There were no enemy ships on the horizon, no aircraft overhead, no radio warnings of British submarines. The sea, at least on the surface, was empty. Then, one of the ships exploded. It did not look like a torpedo strike. There was no telltale plume racing across the water, no incoming shell. The blast came from inside the vessel itself. A flash erupted amidships, followed by a violent column of fire and black smoke that shot hundreds of feet into the air. Within seconds, secondary explosions ripped through the hull as ammunition magazines ignited. Steel plates peeled back like paper. Men were thrown into the sea. The shock wave rolled across the water and struck the surrounding destroyers. For a moment, no one understood what had happened. Officers on nearby ships shouted orders to scan for submarines. Gun crews swung their barrels toward empty horizons. Lookouts searched frantically for periscopes or aircraft silhouettes, but there was nothing. No attacker, no visible cause, only a burning ship breaking apart in the cold North Sea. Survivors later described the explosion as instantaneous, a blinding white flash followed by suffocating heat. Some remembered hearing a sharp crack deep within the ship before the main detonation, as if something inside the hull had snapped. Others recalled a strange smell in the minutes before the blast, like acidic fumes drifting through lower compartments. Few connected those sensations to what would follow. Within minutes, the destroyer was lost. German Naval Command initially treated the incident as enemy action. The North Sea in 1942 was a contested and dangerous theater. British submarines prowled aggressively. Magnetic mines had already claimed numerous vessels. Coastal command aircraft frequently hunted Kriegsmarine ships. The assumption was simple: this had to be an attack. But there was a problem. Hydrophone operators on accompanying ships had detected no torpedo approach, no explosion beneath the keel, no underwater signature consistent with a mine. The damage pattern did not match previous torpedo strikes. Instead of a breach along the hull, the most violent destruction had originated near the forward magazine, the armored compartment where cordite propellant and shells were stored. Still, war leaves little room for doubt. The official preliminary conclusion blamed a mine or unseen submarine. Patrols intensified. Depth charges were dropped into empty seas. Tension spread through the flotillas operating out of German ports. Then it happened again. Another destroyer, another sudden internal explosion. Again, no torpedo wake, no external impact. Once more, the blast seemed to originate from within the ship itself, centered around the ammunition storage areas. Survivors were fewer this time. The detonation was catastrophic, splitting the vessel and sending debris raining across the water. Now fear began to spread. Kriegsmarine crews were trained to expect enemy fire. They understood the risks of torpedoes and bombs. But how do you defend against something that requires no enemy presence? Sailors began whispering about sabotage. Was there a British agent somewhere in the supply chain? Had explosives been planted aboard the ships before departure? Were magnetic mines attaching themselves silently to hulls without detection? Engineers inspected the wreckage that could be recovered. Investigators questioned survivors. Every theory pointed outward, toward the British, toward secret weapons, toward some hidden form of attack. No one seriously considered that the danger might already be stored, safely and legally, inside the ships themselves. In mess halls and engine rooms, the psychological toll began to mount. Destroyer crews, often young men in their early 20s, started glancing uneasily at the armored doors leading to ammunition compartments. Magazine crews double-checked temperature readings. Officers ordered additional inspections of propellant storage conditions. Yet nothing appeared abnormal.
The cordite charges were properly stowed, sealed in brass cartridges, stacked according to regulation. On paper, everything was safe, but paper does not reveal chemistry. By late summer 1942, rumors circulated through German naval bases along the North Sea coast. Some sailors believed the British had developed a new type of delayed action weapon. Others suspected faulty ship design. A few quietly wondered whether Germany's own industrial output, strained for war, had begun cutting corners in ammunition production. High Command faced an unsettling reality. These were not isolated incidents of battle damage. These were ships detonating without engagement. Destroyers were valuable assets, fast, versatile, essential for escort duties and coastal defense. Losing them without a fight was strategically embarrassing and operationally dangerous. Admirals demanded answers. Technical boards convened. Reports were compiled comparing blast patterns, survivor testimony, and magazine schematics. One detail kept resurfacing. In both cases, the initial flash had originated in the forward magazine area, where cordite propellant for the main guns was stored. Cordite, stable under proper conditions, was not supposed to simply explode, and yet it had. For the crews still at sea, the uncertainty was worse than enemy fire. A torpedo is terrifying, but it is visible, external, comprehensible. An internal explosion feels like betrayal, as if the ship itself has turned against its sailors. Men began sleeping lightly. The smell of oil and machinery, once routine, now carried a faint undercurrent of suspicion. Any unusual heat in a compartment sparked alarm. Every minor malfunction became a potential omen. The North Sea remained as gray and indifferent as ever. Patrols continued, convoys moved, gunnery drills were performed with mechanical precision. But beneath the discipline, a question lingered in every mind. If there was no enemy attack, what destroyed those ships? The official narrative still pointed outward, to mines, to submarines, to invisible British hands. It was easier to believe in a clever adversary than to confront the possibility of something far more mundane and far more unsettling. Because if the explosions were not caused by enemy weapons, then the threat was already on board, and it was waiting.
Inside every warship, behind thick steel doors and layers of armored bulkheads, lies a space more dangerous than any enemy torpedo: the magazine. It is the heart of a destroyer's firepower and at the same time its greatest vulnerability. In 1942, as German destroyers tore through the North Sea, these compartments were packed with shells and propellant charges, stacked with precision, inventoried with care, and trusted completely. To understand how a ship can destroy itself, you have to understand what lives inside that armored chamber. Naval guns do not fire bullets. They fire heavy shells, steel projectiles designed to punch through hulls or explode on impact. But the shell alone does nothing. It needs force behind it. That force comes from propellant, and in the Second World War, that propellant was usually cordite. Cordite looks harmless at first glance. It is formed into sticks or bundled charges, often sealed inside brass cartridges. It feels solid, controlled, industrial. But chemically, cordite is a delicate balance of nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin stabilized with additives. It is not an explosive in the same sense as TNT. It is a propellant designed to burn extremely fast, creating expanding gases that hurl a shell out of a gun barrel at tremendous velocity. When it burns properly, it produces controlled violence. When it does not, the result can be catastrophic. Cordite is stable when fresh and stored correctly. That stability depends on chemistry. Over time, however, the stabilizing agents that keep it from decomposing begin to break down. Heat accelerates the process. Moisture, improper ventilation, or long storage periods can push it further toward instability. As cordite ages, it begins to release gases. the internal structure of the propellant can change, sensitivity increases. In extreme cases, degraded cordite can auto-ignite. Naval designers understood this risk. That is why magazines were placed low in the ship, often below the waterline, where temperatures were cooler. Ventilation systems were installed to keep air circulating. Strict inspection schedules were followed. Propellant batches were regularly tested. On paper, the system was safe, but chemistry does not care about paperwork. By mid-1942, Germany's war machine was operating under immense strain. Supplies were captured, redistributed, transported across occupied Europe. Ammunition came from multiple sources: domestic factories, seized depots, repurposed stock. Every shipment carried documentation listing its production date, storage condition, and certification. Officers trusted those documents. They had to. When a destroyer loaded shells and cordite charges before departure, the crew did not chemically test each batch. They relied on labels, records, and supply officers' assurances. If the paperwork said the propellant was fresh and stable, it was treated as such. Inside the magazine, temperatures were monitored, logs were logged. Nothing unusual appeared. Yet if the propellant itself had already begun degrading before it ever reached the ship, no thermometer could reverse that decay. As cordite breaks down, it can produce acidic byproducts. Those byproducts further accelerate decomposition. The process feeds itself, slowly at first, almost invisibly. A charge that looks perfectly intact from the outside may contain internal chemical instability. Under confinement, surrounded by other charges, even a small ignition can trigger a chain reaction. Imagine dozens, sometimes hundreds of propellant charges stacked together in a steel compartment, each one capable of producing immense gas pressure when ignited. If one begins to burn uncontrollably, the flame can leap instantly to neighboring charges. The pressure builds faster than the compartment can vent it. In seconds, the magazine becomes a bomb. This is why naval history is filled with magazine disasters. Long before the Second World War, ships had vanished in sudden internal explosions, often attributed to enemy fire, sometimes to accidental ignition. The pattern was always the same: a flash below decks, then total destruction. In the North Sea incidents of 1942, survivors reported something telling. There had been no external shock before the blast, no shudder of impact. Instead, there was a sudden eruption from within. Some described a brief delay, a strange moment of confusion before the full detonation. That sequence aligns far more closely with internal propellant ignition than with a torpedo strike. A torpedo tears into the hull from outside, sending water and steel inward. An internal magazine explosion blows outward, lifting decks, splitting keels, and throwing superstructure into the sky. Investigators examining the wreckage fragments noted severe upward force, turrets displaced, deck plating peeled back. It suggested pressure building from below. Still, the idea that properly stored cordite could simply ignite was difficult to accept. Regulations were strict, storage conditions were controlled. German naval engineering was considered among the best in the world. To suggest that ammunition itself had become unstable was to suggest a systemic failure, one buried in supply chains rather than battle tactics. And yet, the chemistry remained unforgiving. Cordite manufactured years earlier, if not rotated out of service or carefully tested, could reach a dangerous state. Stabilizers such as diphenylamine were designed to slow decomposition, but they were not permanent solutions. Once depleted, the breakdown could accelerate rapidly. The material might sweat, emit fumes, or generate heat internally. In enclosed storage, especially within metal casings, that heat could concentrate. All it would take was a spark, a slight temperature rise, friction, or sometimes nothing more than the propellant reaching its tipping point.
On a destroyer slicing through cold northern waters, engines vibrating, steel flexing with each wave, ammunition resting in tight confinement, the environment was far from static. Ships are living machines. They vibrate constantly. Micro-movements ripple through hull and frame. If degraded propellant had been loaded aboard, those normal operational stresses might have been enough to trigger the first unstable charge. And once one ignited, the rest would follow almost instantly. From the outside, it would look like sudden annihilation. No torpedo trail, no enemy shell, just a ship erupting into fire. The terrifying truth is that such a disaster does not require sabotage. It does not require espionage or advanced weaponry. It requires only time, imperfect storage, and trust in a label that may no longer reflect reality. In 1942, as German destroyers continued their operations, officers remained focused on external threats. Submarines, aircraft, mines, those were the visible dangers. Meanwhile, inside armored magazines, stacked neatly behind heavy doors, lay a force governed not by tactics, but by chemistry. And chemistry keeps its own schedule.
On the southern coast of England, far from the cold gray waters of the North Sea, stood a quiet ordnance depot carved into the shoreline at Pritty's Hard in Hampshire. Brick storehouses lined the water. Narrow rail tracks ran between storage buildings. Barges moved slowly along the creek, loading and unloading crates marked with stenciled codes and lot numbers. To an outsider, it looked orderly, almost mundane. But inside those walls sat the lifeblood of naval warfare. Shells, fuses, and thousands upon thousands of cordite charges. By 1940 and 1941, Britain was fighting for survival. Ammunition production surged, storage depots overflowed. Old stock had to be rotated, inspected, reclassified, or destroyed. New batches arrived constantly from factories across the country. Clerks worked long hours, logging shipments, updating ledgers, transferring crates from one warehouse to another. Every box required documentation. Every movement was recorded on paper. War, however, does not slow down for perfect administration. Among the civilian staff at Pritty's Hard was a clerk named Albert Finch. He was not a scientist, not a naval officer, not a saboteur. He was a paperwork man, responsible for recording incoming and outgoing cordite shipments, updating batch numbers, and ensuring inventory matched the ledger books. In peacetime, such work might have been routine and forgiving. In wartime, under pressure, with shipments arriving urgently and inspections piling up, small errors could slip through. Cordite required careful monitoring. Batches were categorized by age and stability. Older propellant, especially if chemical tests showed signs of deterioration, was supposed to be marked for restricted use or disposal. Fresh stock was labeled clearly and prioritized for frontline deployment. The difference between those categories existed entirely in documentation, in ink, stamps, and signatures. At some point amid the rush, a mislabeling occurred. A batch of older cordite, chemically unstable but not yet condemned, was logged incorrectly. Whether it was a transposed number, a misread lot code, or a simple clerical oversight, the effect was the same. Aging propellant was recorded as newer, stable stock. In the ledger, it appeared safe. On paper, it passed inspection. No alarm sounded. No one noticed. Then the war shifted. In the early years of the conflict, German forces captured significant quantities of British military equipment in campaigns in Norway, France, and elsewhere. Ammunition depots were overrun, supplies were seized, crates marked with British designations were transported back into German-controlled territory. Among the captured material were naval shells and cordite propellant, valuable resources in a war that consumed industrial output at staggering rates. Captured ammunition was examined, sorted, and in many cases repurposed. If it met technical standards, it could be adapted for use or broken down for components. German supply officers relied on the documentation accompanying shipments. If records indicated a certain production date and stability classification, those records were accepted unless obvious defects appeared. The mislabeled cordite sitting in its crates showed no dramatic outward sign of decay. It had not yet reached the point of visible breakdown. It bore the markings of acceptable stock. It entered the German supply chain as legitimate material. From there, it moved like any other batch of propellant, transferred between depots, reassigned to naval stores, eventually loaded onto destroyers operating in the North Sea. No British agent followed it. No intelligence officer tracked its journey in real time. It passed through hands that trusted the labels they read. By the time it reached the magazines of German warships, the cordite had already begun its slow chemical decline. Stabilizers were depleting, decomposition gases were forming invisibly within sealed charges. The process had likely begun months earlier, perhaps even before the paperwork error. But the mislabeling ensured one critical outcome. It was not flagged, not tested again with urgency, not removed from circulation. In a destroyer preparing for patrol, ammunition loading was methodical. Shells were hoisted aboard, cartridges were stacked carefully in armored compartments, logs were signed, officers confirmed receipt. Everything matched the documents. Everything appeared correct. The tragedy of bureaucratic systems is that they function on trust. A single entry in a ledger can determine the fate of material weighing tons. In wartime, when speed matters as much as accuracy, the margin for error narrows. One miswritten code can move unstable material into frontline service. At Pretty's Hard, the clerk who made the mistake likely never knew its consequences. He would have seen columns of numbers, shipment codes, dates. He would not have imagined that somewhere across the sea, years later, steel warships would rupture because of a line in his ledger. When German destroyers began exploding in 1942, investigators searched for saboteurs and secret devices. They did not trace the origin back to a quiet British depot and a mislabeled batch of propellant. There was no dramatic act of espionage to uncover, no planted bomb, no timed detonator, just paperwork. In war, we often imagine destruction as the product of strategy, of brilliant planning or ruthless intent. But sometimes catastrophe begins in fluorescent-lit offices, in the turning of pages, in the misreading of a number. The cordite did what unstable cordite eventually does. It decomposed, it reached its limit, it ignited. And by the time it did, it was locked in the armored heart of a warship, far from the Hampshire coast, where its fate had quietly been sealed.
By late 1942, the explosions could no longer be dismissed as isolated misfortune. Too many ships had been lost. Too many sailors had died without ever seeing an enemy. What began as confusion hardened into alarm inside the Kriegsmarine's command structure. Destroyers were not disposable assets. They were critical for escort duty, convoy protection, and coastal defense. Losing them without combat was not just tragic, it was strategically unacceptable. An official investigation was ordered. Naval engineers, ordnance specialists, and intelligence officers were assigned to examine every fragment of evidence. Survivors were interrogated in detail. Every second before each explosion was reconstructed from testimony. Did anyone see a torpedo wake? Did radar detect aircraft? Were there reports of floating mines in the area? Had any suspicious individuals boarded the vessels before departure? The pattern was deeply unsettling. In case after case, there was no confirmed external attack. Hydrophone logs revealed no submarine signatures. Coastal radar stations had reported no British bombers. Nearby ships had seen no shell splashes. The sea had been empty. That left one possibility few were comfortable confronting. Something inside the ships had failed. German investigators carefully studied the damage patterns. In torpedo strikes, hull plates are forced inward, water floods compartments first. But in these incidents, recovered debris suggested outward force, decks blown upward, turrets displaced vertically, superstructure fragments scattered in wide arcs. The epicenter consistently appeared to be the forward magazine. Still, the idea of spontaneous detonation was difficult to accept. German ammunition standards were rigorous, storage protocols were strict, magazine temperatures were recorded daily. Officers insisted procedures had been followed precisely. If not enemy action, then sabotage. The sabotage theory quickly gained traction. Could British intelligence have infiltrated dockyards? Could a time-delayed device have been planted inside ammunition shipments? The idea of a hidden bomb was easier to comprehend than unstable propellant quietly decomposing in storage. Sabotage had intent. Sabotage had an enemy face. Naval counterintelligence officers widened their scope. Dock workers were screened. Background checks intensified. Communications were monitored. Any irregularity, any rumor of dissent was treated seriously. Germany in 1942 was a state deeply paranoid about internal betrayal. The possibility of foreign agents operating within naval facilities fit an existing narrative of covert war. But nothing concrete emerged. No detonators were found in recovered wreckage. No chemical residues inconsistent with standard ammunition appeared in analysis. No credible suspect was identified. The sabotage hypothesis remained plausible but unproven. Meanwhile, the explosions continued to haunt the fleet. Sailors boarding destroyers for patrol duty carried an invisible burden. Some quietly wrote letters home before departure. Others developed rituals, double-checking hatch seals, inspecting magazine doors, glancing nervously at temperature gauges. Confidence eroded, not because of enemy superiority, but because the threat felt unknowable. High command needed certainty. Technical boards examined the cordite itself. Samples from surviving ships were tested. Stability readings appeared within acceptable limits. On paper, nothing suggested imminent danger, yet chemical degradation is not always uniform. One batch may appear stable, while another, produced earlier or stored differently, may be nearing failure. Without precise knowledge of every shipment's history, conclusions were incomplete. The investigation became a maze of partial evidence and frustrated logic. Every path seemed to lead outward, to British mines, to secret weapons, to unseen submarines, and then collapse under scrutiny. Across the sea, British intelligence quietly observed the confusion. Reports of unexplained German naval explosions filtered back through intercepted communications and reconnaissance summaries. Within certain circles, questions began to form. Could this be linked to captured ammunition? Could unstable propellant have found its way into German supply lines? One British intelligence officer, James Ashworth, examined ordnance records and capture reports with growing interest. He was not looking for glory, he was looking for patterns. If aging cordite had been mislabeled before capture, and if that material had later been integrated into enemy stockpiles, the consequences might explain everything. The realization, if true, carried enormous strategic weight. There had been no sabotage operation, no deliberate British plan to seed defective ammunition. If unstable cordite was detonating aboard German ships, it was the result of accident, and administrative failure amplified by war. Ashworth faced a decision familiar to intelligence services: reveal or remain silent. Publicly acknowledging the cause might prevent future disasters, but it would also alert Germany to inspect and replace potentially unstable propellant, eliminating a hidden vulnerability.
Silence, on the other hand, meant allowing the enemy to continue operating under false assumptions. In war, information is a weapon. The decision was made to classify the findings. No announcement, no correction, no warning. Back in Germany, investigators reached no definitive conclusion. Official reports hedged their language. Possible mine, possible internal malfunction, cause undetermined. The absence of certainty itself was corrosive. Naval crews continued operating under a cloud of doubt, never fully trusting the ammunition stored beneath their feet. The tragedy of the investigation was not incompetence. German engineers were capable, methodical, thorough. The tragedy was that they were searching for a mastermind when none existed. They were hunting sabotage when the real cause was chemistry set in motion long before the ships ever sailed. And so the mystery endured, not because it was unsolvable, but because its solution was too ordinary, too bureaucratic, too accidental to fit the expectations of wartime logic. Steel ships, armed with heavy guns and disciplined crews, had been undone not by an enemy fleet, but by a flaw hidden in paperwork and sealed inside ammunition crates. The investigators closed their files without the answer. The sea kept its silence.
By 1943, the unexplained explosions had done more than sink ships. They had altered behavior. In naval warfare, material losses can be measured in tonnage. Psychological damage cannot. The Kriegsmarine entered the later years of the war carrying an invisible weight, uncertainty about the reliability of its own weapons. Destroyers that once operated aggressively in the North Sea and along occupied coasts began moving with increased caution. Magazine inspections became more frequent. Temperature logs were scrutinized. Ammunition handling procedures were tightened beyond already strict regulations. Yet procedure can only control what is understood, and the true cause of the earlier disasters remained officially unresolved. The timing was significant. As the war shifted toward the Atlantic and Western Europe braced for eventual invasion, German naval forces were expected to play a defensive role. Fast attack craft, destroyers, and coastal units would be critical in disrupting Allied movements. Confidence in equipment was essential. Crews needed to believe that if their ship was lost, it would be to enemy action, not to spontaneous destruction from within. But whispers lingered. Sailors talk. Even in tightly controlled military systems, stories spread between ports, between crews, between shore leave conversations, ships that blew themselves apart, explosions without torpedoes, men lost in seconds without ever firing a shot. Official explanations never fully silenced private doubt. By the time preparations for the Allied invasion of Western Europe intensified in 1944, German naval resources were already stretched thin. The Kriegsmarine was smaller than it had been at the start of the war. Surface vessels operated under constant threat from Allied air superiority. Fuel shortages limited training and patrol frequency. In that atmosphere, even a handful of mysterious internal disasters had outsized impact. When D-Day approached in June 1944, German destroyers and coastal units faced overwhelming Allied naval power. The invasion fleet was vast beyond precedent. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, supply ships stretching across the English Channel. German commanders needed every available vessel ready and reliable. And yet, in the back of institutional memory, there remained the knowledge that some ships had been lost without visible enemy engagement. That memory influences decision-making in subtle ways. Commanders become cautious, crews double-check rather than act instinctively. Aggression gives way to calculation. History often highlights grand strategy, the planning of Operation Overlord, the deception campaigns, the air superiority battles. But beneath those sweeping narratives lie smaller, quieter influences: logistics, maintenance,
confidence in supply chains, the integrity of ammunition. The accidental chain that began with mislabeled cordite months or years earlier had ripple effects no one could measure precisely. There was no dramatic turning point where an admiral declared, "We cannot attack because our ammunition might explode." War does not work that way. Instead, the impact was cumulative, a subtle erosion of certainty. Meanwhile, on the British side, the knowledge, or at least the strong suspicion that captured unstable propellant may have contributed to enemy losses, remained classified. It was never celebrated as a clever operation. There had been no operation, no deliberate deception, just a clerical error amplified by circumstance. And that may be what makes this story so unsettling. We are accustomed to believing that wars are shaped by brilliant plans or catastrophic blunders made in battle. We expect sabotage, espionage, secret weapons. But sometimes the decisive factor is neither heroic nor malicious. It is administrative. A single misrecorded batch number, an aging chemical stabilizer, a crate captured and repurposed, a magazine sealed and trusted. The explosions in the North Sea were not the result of a mastermind's design. They were the intersection of chemistry and bureaucracy under the pressure of total war. Once the degraded cordite reached its breaking point, physics took over. Flames spread faster than human reaction. Steel failed. Ships vanished. The sailors who died in those blasts never knew the origin of the force that killed them. Investigators never closed the case. Commanders adapted without ever receiving a definitive answer, and history moved on to larger battles, larger headlines, larger tragedies. But in the quiet analysis of wartime logistics, this episode stands as a reminder that modern warfare is sustained not only by strategy and courage, but by paperwork. Industrial war depends on records, production dates, inspection stamps, transport logs. When those systems falter, even slightly, consequences can travel across borders and years before revealing themselves. In the end, no secret sabotage program was uncovered, no hidden British superweapon was exposed, no dramatic confession ever surfaced, just chemistry, paperwork, and consequences. The North Sea swallowed the evidence, the archives preserved fragments, and somewhere in the chain of events that shaped the outcome of the war in Europe, a simple clerical mistake played its quiet, deadly role. History remembers the invasions, the speeches, the decisive battles, but sometimes wars are shaped by mistakes no one meant to make.